In this video, we are going to learn about the advantages and risks of in situ conservation and some other topics. In situ maintenance of biodiversity through the establishment of conservation and multiple use areas offers distinct advantages over off-site methods in terms of coverage, viability of the resource, and the economic sustainability of the methods. First one is the coverage. In situ approach can cover a wide area and would allow a significant number of indigenous species and systems to be protected, thus taking care of the unknowns until such time as methods are found for their investigation and utilization. Next point is the viability. As a result of in situ conservation, natural selection and community evolution continue, and new community systems and genetic material are produced. Then the economic sustainability. When an area is set aside as an in situ conservation approach, a country can maintain specific economic sustainability. When an area is set aside as an in situ conservation approach, a country can maintain specific examples of biodiversity stores up future economic benefits. When the need develops and this diversity is thoroughly examined, commercially valuable genetic and biochemical materials may be found. However, it is not sufficient to establish a conservation area and then assume its biodiversity is automatically protected and without risk. Many risks, both natural and anthropogenic, remain in place, as Schaffer cited four broad categories of natural risks. These risks include demographic uncertainty resulting from random events in the survival and reproduction of individuals, environmental uncertainty, which is due to random or at least unpredictable changes in weather, food supply, and the populations of competitors, predators, parasites, etc. Natural catastrophes such as floods, fires, or droughts, which may occur at random intervals. Genetic uncertainty or random changes in genetic makeup due to genetic drift or inbreeding that alter the survival and reproductive probabilities of individuals. The greatest uncertainties, however, are often human created. Habitat destruction for human settlement and associated development inventions. Habitat destruction for human settlement and associated development interventions is the most important factor contributing to the diminishing mosaic of biodiversity. These uncertainties can only be met with a full array of conservation programs, including those that use ex situ methods. Ex situ conservation. Ex situ conservation means the conservation of species outside their natural range, such as in zoos, botanic gardens, aquaria, and seed banks. It is a last resort which is used only after it is evident that it is impossible to preserve the ecosystem or habitat. The Convention on Biological Diversity specifically recommends that ex situ measures be adopted as necessary in situations where in situ conservation programs do not prove to be adequate. These measures have most extensively been applied to conserve cultivated and domesticated agrobiodiversity, employing techniques such as botanical gardens, zoos, seed banks, field gene banks, in vitro storage, and captive breeding measures. Now, gene banks, we will be explaining gene bank topic. Plant genetic resources, gene banks choose, maintain, and reproduce living samples of the world's huge diversity of crop varieties and their wild relatives. They ensure that the varieties and land races of the crops and their wild relatives that end up in our food supply are both secure in the long term and available for use by farmers, plant breeders, and researchers. So, community seed banks in many developing countries, farmers rely on informal seed systems based on local growers' retention of seed from previous harvests, storage, treatment, and exchange of the seed within and between communities. The informal seed sector is typically based on indigenous structures for information flow and exchange of seeds. Seed banks managed within this local seed system operate on a small scale at the community level with few resources. Next one is the botanical gardens and zoos. Botanical gardens and zoos are the most conventional methods of ex situ conservation, all of which household protected specimens for breeding and reintroduction into the wild when necessary and possible. These facilities provide not only housing and care for specimens of endangered species but also have an educational value. Field gene banks. Field gene banks or living collections are the main conservation strategy for long lived perennials, recalcitrant species, and vegetative propagated species. Their main limitation is that they take a great deal of space and are difficult to maintain and protect from natural disasters. They are susceptible to the spread of diseases and may suffer from neglect. Now, what is in vitro conservation? In vitro conservation of plant genetic resource is becoming a complementary approach to the conventional conservation methods. It is used to save plant materials for long, medium, and long term time in a small place and in a controlled condition. It is cost effective and can be simply transferred from one country to another country, and it is used to as a tool to implement the convention of biological diversity through the equitable share of the products of genetic resources. Conservation in vitro is wholly dependent upon the techniques of plant cell, tissue, and organ culture and is appropriate in situations where conventional seed storage cannot or is not be employed. The material stored in vitro may be protoplast, isolated cells grown in suspension or on semi solid medium, meristem cultures at various stages of development or organized plantlet. The material stored in vitro may be protoplast, isolated cells grown in suspension or on semi-solid medium, meristem cultures at various stages of development or organized plantlet. It can be assumed that genetic stability within the in vitro systems increase as the complexity of the cultured material with completely differentiated plantlets in culture having the least risk of genetic alteration during an in vitro excursion. In vitro conservation is the most useful and efficient way to distribute clonal materials. It facilitates the availability of planting materials at any time, avoid the transfer of major pests and pathogens, and makes virus irradiation through meristem culture. Next is the captive breeding. Habitat protection alone is not sufficient if the expressed goal of the World Conservation Strategy, the maintenance of biotic diversity, is to be achieved. Establishment of self-sustaining captive populations and other supportive intervention will be needed to avoid the loss of many species, especially those at high risk in greatly reduced, highly fragmented, and distributed habitats. Captive breeding programs need to be established before species are reduced to critically low numbers and thereafter need to be coordinated internationally according to sound biological principles with a view to the maintenance or re-establishment of viable populations in the world. Many endangered species are being bred in zoos to boost populations and reintroduce them into the wild. This introduction should be compatible with the wild ecosystem and should not be with potential harm with the wild flora and fauna. Otherwise, it is worthless if there is not adequate habitat left in the world. In general, captive breeding approach becomes necessary when populations in the wild have declined to such low levels that they may not be self-sustaining, where threats to populations and or other habitats are so severe that extinction is deemed likely and or where captive individuals and their offsprings can be protected from natural enemies or other functions causing high mortality so that numbers can be built up either to augment source populations or to found new populations by translocation or other controlled release. Having all the above advantages, undertaking captive breeding can also cause severe problems Potential for disease transmission from captive animals to both humans and wild species. Potential for loss of genetic integrity amongst populations of wild species should they breed with escaped captive animals, which are often non-indigenous or hybridized. Questionable caring treatment of the animals in captivity, reduced incentive to conserve wild populations and their habitats. Now let's learn about what are the risks and advantages of ex situ conservation. Ex situ conservation is complementary to the rehabilitation and restoration of degraded ecosystems and the recovery of threatened species. Ex situ conservation facilitates provide excellent opportunities for researchers to study plants, animals, and microorganisms in controlled conditions and to improve collection, storage, and regeneration technique. Ex situ facilities can also be used for germplasm evaluation as centers for documentation and information systems and for providing information on genetic resources on a commercial basis. Ex situ facilities can also be used for germplasm evaluation as centers for documentation and information systems and for providing information on genetic resources on a commercial basis. Captive breeding of wild animals can be used to restore endangered species populations. It is important to increase populations as quickly as possible and reintroduce the animals back to their original habitat to minimize genetic erosion. Plants can also be reintroduced to their natural areas of occurrence. Ex situ conservation approach has also its own risk unless the reintroductions are performed in such a way that other indigenous species are not harmed or adversely affected. Similarly, care must be taken while collecting material or animals for ex situ conservation not to endanger other native species and genetic resources. The regulation and management of such transactions require accurate information to determine the impact of collection on populations and ecosystems. Now, the next one is the complementary conservation. A complementary conservation strategy can be defined as a combination of different conservation strategies like in situ and ex situ conservations, which together lead to an optimum sustainable use of genetic diversity existing in a target gene pool in the present and future. It is an approach which involves striking the right balance between different methods employed. It depends on the species being conserved, the local infrastructure and human resources, the number of accessions in a given collection, its geographic site, and intended use of conserved germplasm. This approach offers a criterion for choice and is basic to general procedures for priority setting in relation to explicit goals. Circa situ conservation. The term circa situ conservation is the conservation of components of biological diversity outside their natural habitat but managed within traditional systems by local farmers. It has been used for a range of practices commonly associated especially with more traditional used for a range of practices commonly associated especially with much more traditional and biodiversity rich agricultural systems. They include the deliberate encouragement of certain species of wild plants in natural habitats and retention of valued wild plants when land is cleared for agriculture or crops are weeded, the growing of valued wild plants in home gardens, and the selection and storage of seed at household level for later replanting. Next one is the habitat based conservation approach. The most important direct drivers of biodiversity loss and ecosystem change are habitat change for other competing land uses such as the conservation or conversion of biodiversity rich areas into agriculture, settlement, infrastructure, and other investments. Climate change, invasive alien species, overexploitation of species, and population pollution are also equally affecting the ecosystem concerned. Hence, habitat protection is now recognized as a prerequisite for species survival, and it is very essential to identify and map habitats with large number of endemic species. Now, the protected area management approach. The term protected areas encompasses the range of landscapes and seascapes that are managed to conserve and maintain elements of biodiversity and natural habitat. They have long been one of the main strategies for safeguarding the world's biodiversity. They play a central role in conservation strategies, and they provide a multiple flow of benefits to society and may be established to protect a wide variety of features such as characteristic or unique ecosystem, special species of interest, value, rarity, or under threat like rhinoceros, Valia ibex, sites of unusual species diversity, landscape or geographical features of aesthetic or scientific value, hydrological protective functions, soil, water, local climate, facilities for natural recreation. Example lakes, beaches, mountain views, wildlife spectacles, sites of special scientific interest, areas of long standing research, and cultural sites, temples, and archaeological excavations. The relative value and importance of each feature will need to be considered to establish a protected area. In Ethiopia, to improve the management of protected areas, the new Ethiopian Wildlife Proclamation of 2007 creates four types of administration approaches for effective management, which include the federal government administrated areas. These conservation areas are nationally and globally significant because of the representative ecological zones they represent and those with immense diversity of wildlife. National parks and wildlife sanctuaries where endangered and endemic species live. Wildlife conservation areas that straddles two or more regions in Ethiopia, and finally any wildlife conservation areas transcending the national border. The regional state administered conservation areas. Conservation areas such as wildlife conservation parks, wildlife sanctuaries, wildlife research, and wildlife controlled hunting areas, which are not designated and administered by the federal government pursuant to Article 4 of the proclamation, are decided to be administered under the regional states. Private investors administer conservation areas. Private investors may be authorized to administer the wildlife conservation areas under either the federal or regional governments by the concession arguments to be concluded with the federal or the concerned regional governments. Local communities administer conservation areas. Wildlife habitats other than the conservation areas referred to in Article 4, 5, and 6 of this proclamation can be administered by the local communities. Considerations to be included in taking protection measures. Area coverage of protected areas should be proportional to high biological diversity and diverse habitats based on situations in a particular country. Strictly protected areas should not be islands or degraded lands. Establishment of policy for intact forests and areas hotspots of biodiversity. Incorporation of protection measures with measures to provide benefit to local people and governments. A combination of approaches that stabilize or reduce the human population pressure and reduce pressure on forest areas by providing alternatives of food and fuel production elsewhere. Now, the next major topic is the conservation based on components. The genetic based conservation approach. The term genetic conservation is used for the genetic based conservation approach The term genetic conservation is used for the maintenance and utilization of genetic diversity. A genetic reserve or gene management zone is a protected area managed in such a way as to maintain suitable ecological conditions and the conservation needs of one or more target species. The specific actions that apply to genetic resource conservation are: minimize the risk of genetic erosion from demographic fluctuations, environmental variation, and catastrophes, minimize human threats to genetic diversity, support actions that promote genetic diversity in target populations, ensure access to populations for research and plant breeding, ensure availability of material of target populations that are exploited and are cultivated by local people. Species based conservation approach. Many conservation efforts are explicitly concerned with the population status of particular species or groups of species. Others are focused on the conservation of overall species diversity. Both approaches require an understanding of the habitat requirements that support either particular species of concern or the habitat features associated with the high level of species diversity. A species based approach confers some important advantages in that species which are economically important and have large public constituencies provide considerable support to conservation efforts. Species based approaches can also be provide specific measurable targets, examples species persistence, increased abundance and distribution, to evaluate the success of the conservation action. The following conservation measures are the most important subsets of conserving biodiversity at species level.